And what if everything you learned about death is wrong? Most people believe that everything ends with the final breath, as if existence simply fades away. However, ancient writings describe a completely different reality. According to these records, the first 49 days after death constitute a deep, intense, and decisive passage, filled with trials and revelations that determine whether the soul will achieve liberation or be cast back into the cycle of reincarnations. The most alarming part is that almost everyone fails in this process without even realizing it. Few people know, but there is ancient knowledge, almost erased from history, that precisely describes everything that happens during this crucial period. The Tibetan Book of the Dead reveals each stage of this journey and shows how consciousness passes through experiences that resemble vivid dreams or true nightmares. The big question is, why does almost no one talk about this? Why was this knowledge hidden throughout the centuries? There is something they do not want you to discover. If you believe that death is the end of everything, this message may completely transform your perspective. But before continuing, check if you are already subscribed to the channel, because many other contents like this will reveal truths that few people know. Prepare yourself, because what you are about to understand may change everything you thought about life and death. For a long time, death was seen as a definitive ending. However, the ancients knew it was only a passage. These manuscripts describe a path unknown to most, a period of 49 days after death in which the soul faces situations that will define whether it will be liberated or return to the cycle of rebirth. It is like a road full of crossroads, where every decision influences the final destiny. The sages of the past left detailed instructions for those who wish to understand what happens when the heart stops. In the first moments after death, consciousness perceives itself free from the body, without weight, without form, but still bound to the ties of earthly life. This is the most delicate moment. Those who live deeply attached to the material world tend to panic and lose the chance to free themselves. Those who prepared themselves, studied these ancient teachings, and trained the mind for detachment gain the opportunity to see the truth. They understand there is no reason for fear, because death is not an end but a transition into something much greater. Few people know that this passage is directly influenced by how one lived. People who cultivated spiritual practices such as meditation, deep reflection, and study of sacred texts do not see death as a terrifying abyss, but as a natural process. What happens afterward does not depend on an external judgment, but on the state of consciousness itself. Then comes the first great test of the soul, the encounter with the clear light of reality. Right after death, consciousness faces an intense light, impossible to compare with anything in the physical world. The manuscripts describe this light as absolute truth. If the soul surrenders to it without fear, it can free itself permanently from the cycle of reincarnations. The problem is that most are not prepared. Attachment to earthly identity is still strong, fear takes over and many turn away, losing the chance of liberation. This fear is built throughout life, fed by beliefs that treat death as something frightening. Instead of surrendering to the light, the soul tries to cling to what it knows. Memories, familiar faces, beloved voices. But this resistance has a price. By rejecting the light, consciousness enters a much more confusing phase of the journey, where illusions begin to dominate perception. It is like someone who finds a portal to a perfect world, but steps back thinking it is a trap, and ends up lost in shadows and distortions of the past. At this stage, the mind projects images created by its own memories, deceased relatives, religious figures, spiritual guides. However, the ancient texts warn that all of this is created by consciousness, mental traps that keep the soul bound. Just like in dreams, everything feels real until one awakens. When the soul allows itself to be deceived by these projections, it enters the state known as the bardo, an in-between plane between lives, fluid and unstable, where emotions shape reality. Fear creates monsters. Attachment revives past scenes. Guilt creates cycles of suffering. There is no external heaven or hell, only the mind interacting with itself. Some consciousnesses realize they are trapped in this state and try to leave, but new tests arise. Luminous apparitions appear offering help, which, if recognized as illusions, allow liberation. Otherwise, these figures transform into terrifying forms that chase the soul. The key is simple but difficult. Do not react with fear. When consciousness remains serene, everything disappears. It is the same principle as nightmares. Now, when you realize you are dreaming, the monster loses its power. After that comes the life review. There is no external judge. The soul itself relives every experience, feeling exactly what it caused in others. Love generates joy felt twice as strongly. Pain inflicted returns with the same intensity. Everything is seen with absolute clarity, without masks. Those who accept this truth and learn from it can move forward. Those who cling to guilt, regret, and attachment end up being pulled back into the cycle of reincarnations. The most surprising part is that no one imposes a destiny. There is no celestial court. The only judge is consciousness itself. Hell or paradise are not places. They are mental states. That is why some souls return quickly to physical life, while others seem to transcend the cycle. Guilt attracts new existence. Clarity liberates. At the end of the 49 days comes the final decision, to be freed or to be reborn. Those who train the mind to recognize illusions and detach from desires can escape. Those who remain bound to fears and cravings return to learn again. The ancients taught that this process is not punishment, but a natural consequence of what the mind carries. And here arises the great secret. It is possible to leave this cycle while still alive by training consciousness. Deep spiritual practices do not exist merely to make someone good, but to develop enough lucidity to recognize truth at the decisive moment. Meditation, introspection, study of ancient teachings, and mastery of the mind are essential tools for preparing the soul for the great transitions of existence. They are not mere wellness habits or relaxation practices, but profound paths of self-knowledge and inner strengthening. Just as someone unprepared panics in an earthquake, a soul without training becomes lost after death, confused, attached, frightened, and unable to understand what is happening around it. Life, from this perspective, is a great school of consciousness. Every challenge, every pain, every joy, and every choice function as exercises for the spirit. We are not here merely to survive, accumulate possessions, or seek fleeting pleasures. We are here to develop lucidity, emotional balance, detachment, compassion, and mastery of our thoughts. Without this preparation, the mind continues to react impulsively, dominated by fears, desires, and illusions, both in life and beyond it. Meditation is one of the most powerful tools in this process. By silencing the internal noise, the individual begins to realize that they are not their thoughts nor their passing emotions. They begin to observe the mind instead of being dragged by it. Over time, clarity, serenity, and presence develop. This state not only improves everyday life, but prepares consciousness to face any transition with stability. A trained mind does not collapse before the unknown. It observes, understands, and crosses through. Introspection complements this path. Looking inward honestly reveals unconscious patterns, emotional wounds, attachments, and fears that usually command human decisions. Most people live on autopilot, repeating behaviors inherited from childhood, society, and unresolved pain. By deeply observing oneself, the individual begins to free themselves from these invisible chains. They become more aware of who they are and less enslaved by impulsive reactions. This inner liberation is a fundamental step in the soul's evolution. The study of ancient teachings also plays a crucial role in this preparation. Civilizations and spiritual traditions thousands of years old already reflected on death, consciousness, the purpose of life, and the continuity of the spirit. Sacred texts, Eastern philosophies, mystery schools, and mystical traditions always taught that death is not the end, but a passage. They warned that the mental state at the moment of transition deeply influences the experience afterward. A mind full of fear, attachment, and confusion tends to remain bound to dense planes of consciousness. A clear, detached, awakened mind crosses lightly. Mastery of the mind, in turn, is perhaps humanity's greatest challenge. The mind is a wonderful tool when guided well, but a tyrant when out of control. Repetitive negative thoughts generate anxiety, anger, guilt, and suffering. Unlimited desires create constant frustration. Fears projected into the future steal peace from the present. Training the mind means learning to choose thoughts, redirect emotions, and not identify with every inner impulse. It is a daily, silent, and deeply transformative work. When this preparation does not happen, the soul remains fragile. Just as someone without training panics in a natural disaster, an unprepared consciousness despairs when it loses the physical body. Many spiritual accounts and near-death experiences describe people confused, trying to return to the body, attached to family members, homes, possessions, and identities. Fear arises because everything they believed was life suddenly disappears. Without expanded consciousness, the transition becomes a shock. On the other hand, those who cultivated inner lucidity tend to experience the passage with serenity. They recognize the process as natural, feel guided, welcomed, and free. They do not fight the flow of change because they already learned in life to let go, observe, and trust. This difference is not spiritual privilege, but the direct result of conscious preparation. It is important to understand that this training does not require isolation from the world or a monastic life. It happens in small daily choices: how we react to difficulties, how we deal with frustrations, how we treat others, how we care for the mind and emotions. Each time someone chooses consciousness over impulse, they strengthen the soul. Each time they observe a negative thought without identifying with it, they grow inwardly. Each time they practice silence, presence, and gratitude, they expand perception. Modern society, however, moves in the opposite direction. Constant stimulation, endless distractions, excessive consumption, and the relentless pursuit of immediate pleasure keep the mind agitated and superficial. Few people stop to deeply reflect on life, death, and the purpose of existence. Talking about the afterlife is almost taboo, as if ignoring it would make it cease to exist. But the truth is that everyone will pass through that door one day, prepared or not. Therefore, spiritual self-development is not an escape from reality, but preparation for it at its deepest level. Those who train consciousness live better now and cross better later. There is more peace, less fear, more clarity, and more meaning in existence. Suffering decreases because the person stops fighting everything beyond their control. Moreover, this preparation generates compassion. When someone becomes aware of themselves, they also begin to better understand others. They realize that everyone is at different levels of learning, carrying invisible pain and fighting inner battles. Judgment decreases and empathy increases. This higher vibration of consciousness not only transforms the individual, but positively influences the world around them. At its core, the training of the soul is a return to what we have always been, awakened consciousness. It is not about acquiring something new, but removing layers of illusion, fear, and conditioning that cover our essence. Meditation silences the noise. Introspection reveals inner truth. Ancient teachings point the way. Mastery of the mind sustains the journey. And when the great transition arrives, it is not a collapse but a natural continuation. Just as someone well-trained remains calm in chaos, the prepared soul crosses the unknown with lucidity and peace. There is no panic, only consciousness in movement. Therefore, living consciously is the greatest act of spiritual preparation that exists. Every mindful breath, every observed thought, every understood emotion builds this inner stability. Death ceases to be terror and becomes passage. The unknown stops being threat and becomes expansion. In the end, it is not about fearing the afterlife, but about living with presence now, because whoever learns to be awake in life crosses any dimension with clarity. Modern society, however, seems designed to prevent this awakening. Constant consumption, distractions, excess information, endless entertainment. Everything to avoid silence, because it is in silence that truth emerges. Ancient texts always warned that the more a civilization distanced itself from inner consciousness, the more trapped it would become in the cycle of rebirth. The knowledge never completely disappeared. It has always been in manuscripts, forgotten teachings, and deep traditions. The question is, how many are willing to seek it? If all of this is real, an inevitable question arises. Are you prepared for what happens after death? This is not meant to cause fear, but to awaken consciousness. Death is the only certainty of the human experience, and yet it is the most avoided, ignored, or superficially treated subject. We live as if it will never arrive, as if time were infinite and our choices had no consequences beyond the present moment. Yet all spiritual, philosophical, and mystical traditions point to the same principle. Death is not an end, but a transition. The way we live deeply shapes how we cross this passage. Our mind, emotions, attachments, and level of consciousness determine whether the transition will be confusing or serene, turbulent or luminous. Many believe that simply dying automatically brings peace, but ancient teachings say the opposite. We carry with us what we cultivated in life. If the mind is full of fear, it experiences fear. If it is full of anger, it finds conflict. If it is at peace, it finds peace. Most people spend their entire lives identified with the body, the name, social status, possessions, and personal stories. Few stop to investigate who they truly are beyond these layers. When the body ceases to exist, this constructed identity dissolves abruptly. For an unprepared consciousness, it is like losing everything at once. Confusion, attachment, and resistance arise. The soul tries to cling to what it knows, the material world, loved ones, and past experiences. This attachment generates suffering. On the other hand, those who developed consciousness throughout life learn to perceive themselves as something beyond the physical body. They learn that thoughts arise and pass, emotions come and go, and that there is a silent presence behind it all, consciousness itself. This understanding radically transforms the relationship with death. It ceases to be destruction and becomes a change of state. Preparation for this moment does not happen at the final instant of life. It is not something improvised in the face of fear or discovered only when everything familiar begins to fade. It is built slowly, silently, in the ordinary days that seem insignificant. It is formed in every choice, every reaction, every thought nourished and repeated. It is invisible training, but immensely powerful. The soul is always being shaped, even when the mind is distracted. What you practice inwardly becomes your strength outwardly. What you cultivate in small moments becomes your foundation in the great ones. Each time someone chooses to observe fear instead of being dominated by it, they strengthen inner stability. Fear will always arise. It is part of human experience, but it does not need to rule. When fear is watched with awareness rather than fed with resistance or panic, it loses its power. It becomes information instead of a threat. It becomes a passing sensation rather than a controlling force. This practice builds emotional maturity. It teaches the nervous system that discomfort can be survived, that uncertainty can be held, and that peace does not depend on perfect conditions. Each time a person releases an attachment, they learn to cross changes more lightly. Attachment is not only about material things, it is about identities, expectations, relationships, and narratives about how life should unfold. When someone loosens their grip on outcomes, on control, on the need for certainty, something profound happens. Flexibility grows. The heart becomes spacious. Instead of breaking under transformation, it bends and adapts. Life inevitably shifts. People leave, seasons change, bodies age, dreams evolve, and those who have practiced letting go suffer less when these transitions arrive. They do not lose love. They simply stop imprisoning it in fixed forms. Each time the mind is quieted and attention is brought into the present moment, lucidity deepens. The present is where life actually happens, yet most people live trapped in memory or anticipation. The past generates regret, guilt, and nostalgia. The future generates anxiety, worry, and endless planning. But the present holds clarity. When awareness settles into what is happening now, the breath, the body, the sensations, the simple act of being alive, the nervous system relaxes, perception sharpens, and wisdom emerges naturally. This is not escape. It is intimacy with reality. Over time, these small daily practices rewire perception itself. A person becomes less reactive and more responsive, less consumed by emotional storms, and more anchored in observation. Instead of being pulled violently by circumstances, they develop an inner center that remains stable even when everything outside shifts. This is not numbness. It is not suppression. It is strength through awareness. Most people imagine that peace arrives when life becomes easier, when problems disappear, when stability is guaranteed. But real peace is built precisely by learning to remain grounded while life remains uncertain. The storms are not the interruption of growth. They are the training ground for it. Every conflict, disappointment, fear, and loss becomes a lesson in resilience when approached consciously. This preparation is subtle, No one applauds it. There are no external medals for learning to pause before reacting, no trophies for choosing forgiveness over resentment, no public recognition for mastering one's thoughts rather than being consumed by them. Yet this quiet discipline is what determines how someone will experience the most intense moments of life, including illness, heartbreak, aging, and eventually, death itself. When the mind has spent years running from discomfort, seeking constant distraction and resisting pain, the final moments of life often feel terrifying and overwhelming. The unknown becomes unbearable because the nervous system has never learned to rest in uncertainty. But when a person has practiced presence, surrender, and awareness throughout life, even the greatest transitions are met with calm. Not because there is no emotion, but because there is trust in the process of change. This is why spiritual traditions across cultures emphasize daily mindfulness, prayer, contemplation, or meditation, not as rituals for reward, but as training for consciousness. They are exercises for the soul. Just as muscles grow through repeated resistance, inner peace grows through repeated awareness. Every time someone chooses patience over impulsiveness, they are strengthening emotional intelligence. Every time they choose compassion over judgment, they are softening the heart. Every time they choose honesty over self-deception, they are clarifying perception. These are not small victories. They are the architecture of inner freedom. The mind is like a garden. Whatever is watered will grow. If fear is constantly nourished through worry and catastrophic thinking, it becomes dominant. If anger is replayed through resentment, it becomes habitual. If gratitude is practiced, it expands. If presence is cultivated, it stabilizes awareness. No one escapes this law of attention. Conscious or not, everyone is always training their inner world. Preparation for life's deepest moments, therefore, is not mystical. It is practical. It is built in how someone handles traffic, criticism, loss, boredom, success, and uncertainty. It is visible in whether someone reacts automatically or pauses consciously. It is reflected in whether they cling desperately or trust gently. These patterns eventually define the quality of one's entire existence, and perhaps the greatest realization is this: peace is not something to be achieved in the future. It is something to be practiced now. Strength is not built in crisis alone. It is built in the thousands of small moments where awareness replaces habit. Freedom is not a sudden awakening. It is a slow unlearning of fear-based living. When someone lives this way, they stop fighting life. They start flowing with it. Challenges are no longer seen as punishments but as teachers. Uncertainty is no longer an enemy but a doorway to growth. Change is no longer terrifying but natural. Such a person does not become passive. On the contrary, they become deeply engaged with life, but without desperation. They act, love, build, dream, and strive, yet they are not destroyed when outcomes differ from expectations. Their happiness is rooted within, not negotiated with circumstances. And when the great transitions of life arrive, the endings that everyone must face, they are met not with panic, but with acceptance, not with resistance, but with surrender. Not with fear, but with trust in the continuity of existence beyond form. This is the invisible preparation few people speak about, yet everyone experiences the results of. It is the quiet power of consciousness, shaping destiny from the inside out. Every breath you observe, every fear you soften, every attachment you loosen, every moment you fully inhabit, is shaping who you are becoming. Spiritual traditions have always emphasized this preparation. Monks, mystics, sages, and masters across cultures practiced meditation, prayer, contemplation, and self-mastery not to escape the world, but to understand reality deeply. They knew an undisciplined mind creates suffering, both in life and beyond. They also knew an awakened consciousness crosses any dimension with clarity. The problem is that modern society stimulates the opposite. We are constantly bombarded with distractions, information, consumption, and hurry. Little space remains for silence, deep reflection, and self-knowledge. The mind becomes agitated, fragmented, and reactive. Instead of living with presence, we live on autopilot. And what is not trained in life does not magically appear after death. Imagine someone who never learned to swim being thrown into the open sea. Panic would be inevitable. Likewise, a consciousness that never learned to observe itself, calm itself, and detach enters despair in the great transition, not by punishment, but by lack of preparation. This does not mean death is cruel or threatening. On the contrary, it is a natural process like birth. The problem is not the transition itself, but the inner state with which we cross it. Just as a birth can be more peaceful or more traumatic depending on conditions, the afterlife also reflects the level of consciousness cultivated. Another fundamental point is emotional attachment. Many souls remain bound to unresolved feelings, guilt, regret, hatred, fear, or emotional dependence. These dense states of consciousness create equally dense experiences after death. That is why forgiveness, acceptance, and detachment are so emphasized spiritually. They are not merely moral virtues, they are tools of liberation. Preparing for the afterlife is actually learning to live better now. A conscious person suffers less, reacts with more balance, and finds more meaning in existence. They are not dragged by every emotional crisis or destroyed by every loss. They learn to flow with life's changes with spiritual maturity. And this maturity does not come from blind belief, but from inner experience. It is not about believing something because someone said so, but about investigating consciousness itself, observing the mind, and understanding reality through direct experience. The great irony is that by preparing for death, a person begins to value life more. Every moment becomes precious. Every breath becomes a miracle. Small things gain deep meaning. Fear decreases because life is no longer seen as something fragile that can be lost at any moment, but as a continuous flow of transformation. At its core, the question is not only whether you are prepared for what happens after death. The real question is, are you truly present in your life now? Are you aware of your thoughts, emotions, and choices? Or are you merely surviving on autopilot? Spiritual preparation does not require perfection, but growing awareness. Every step towards self-knowledge counts. Every moment of silence matters. Every choice for love instead of fear strengthens the soul. If all of this is real, and countless reports, traditions, and human experiences point in this direction, then ignoring this preparation is like crossing life without learning how to live. In the end, the afterlife is not an external judgment, but an internal reflection. Consciousness encounters what it cultivated. The mind experiences what it fed. The soul crosses according to how it trained. That is why the question keeps echoing, not as a threat, but as an invitation. Are you prepared for what happens after death? Most people live without reflecting on this, and when the moment comes, they are swallowed by illusions. People spend their lives too busy trying to survive, conquer, consume, please, and accumulate. Days repeat in automatic routines, and rarely does anyone stop to deeply think about the meaning of existence, or what happens when everything we call life comes to an end. Death is treated as something distant, almost unreal, until suddenly it becomes inevitable. When that moment arrives, many are taken by shock. Everything that seemed solid, the body, name, relationships, possessions, plans, dissolves at once. Consciousness, accustomed to identifying only with the material world, enters confusion. Fear arises, attachment arises, and the desperate attempt to cling to what no longer exists in the same way begins. That is what it means to be swallowed by illusions, believing we are only what passes, what changes, what can be lost. But is it possible to choose another path? This question changes everything. If consciousness continues beyond the physical body, then the way we live now is not irrelevant. Every thought nourished, every emotion cultivated, every choice made, builds the inner state with which we will cross the great transition. Nothing happens by chance. A mind accustomed to chaos tends to experience chaos. A consciousness accustomed to clarity tends to find clarity. Since the most ancient times, sages and spiritual traditions have taught that human beings are not only flesh and bone, but consciousness in experience. The body would be like a temporary garment, and the mind the instrument through which the soul manifests in the physical world. When this garment is left behind, what remains are not titles, possessions, appearance, or status, but the level of consciousness developed throughout life. What we were inside, as our fears, lucidity, peace, or conflicts, is what moves forward. Faced with this, the inevitable question arises again. If all of this is real, are we prepared for what happens after death? Most people live as if this question did not exist. Immersed in routines, worries, and constant distractions, they rarely stop to reflect on the deeper meaning of existence. Life becomes about surviving, achieving, accumulating, being recognized, but almost never about understanding who one truly is beyond social roles. And when the structures of material life begin to crumble, whether through loss, illness, aging, or death itself, many are swallowed by the illusions they built. Everything that seemed solid reveals itself as fragile. Everything that supported identity disappears. But does it have to be this way? Is it possible to choose another path? Do our actions, thoughts, and state of consciousness today shape not only our present life, but also what we will experience afterward? The answer seems to point to something simple, yet profound. Everything begins with how present we are now. Are we conscious or distracted? Are we truly living the present moment, or constantly escaping it through painful memories of the past and anxieties about the future? Are we cultivating inner peace, or feeding inner conflicts daily? The way we answer these questions, not with words but with how we live, completely defines our life experience. Every emotional reaction, every repeated thought, every automatic choice builds the inner state in which we exist. Most people build their identity on transient things, and although this seems normal, it is one of the greatest sources of human suffering. When someone builds their entire identity on work, losing a job is not just losing a function, it is losing who they believe they are. The ground disappears, self-worth collapses, the sense of personal value falls apart. When someone defines themselves entirely by a relationship, a breakup is not just a separation, it is a deep emotional collapse. Emptiness arises, the feeling of not existing without the other, the despair of losing what supported identity. When someone relies completely on physical appearance, aging becomes an enemy. Every wrinkle becomes a threat. Every bodily change generates fear. Life becomes a fight against time. When health is seen as an eternal guarantee, any diagnosis becomes absolute despair. The person suffers not only physically, but from the collapse of the illusion of control. Thus, fragile identities are built upon things that inevitably change. And when they change, because they always do, people collapse with them. That is when illusions fall. And it is precisely in these moments of rupture that many begin to awaken. They realize that seeking stability only outside is like building a house on sand. Everything may seem firm for a while, but any storm is enough to bring it down. Then, a new way of living emerges. It is when someone stops seeking security only in circumstances and begins to build balance within. It is when happiness no longer depends entirely on external events. It is when peace begins to arise from within outward, not the other way around. This is the path of consciousness, a path of presence, of inner observation, of spiritual maturation. That is why, since ancient times, sages always emphasized practices such as meditation, introspection, mastery of the mind, and the study of spiritual teachings, not as empty rituals, but as tools to prepare consciousness. Just as someone unprepared panics during an earthquake, a mind without training collapses in the face of major life changes, including death. A trained consciousness learns to observe emotions without drowning in them. It learns to perceive thoughts without completely identifying with them. It learns to find stability, even when everything around changes, and this completely transforms the experience of living. The person stops being a hostage to circumstances, stops being dragged by every problem, every loss, every fear. They begin to live with more clarity, serenity, and depth. It does not mean pain disappears. It does not mean challenges stop existing. But it means consciousness strengthens to cross them without destroying itself inside. And if this applies to life's great upheavals, why would it not apply to the transition of death as well? If death is, as so many traditions teach, merely a change in the state of consciousness, then what we carry with us is not the body, possessions, or social roles, but the level of lucidity, peace, or confusion we cultivated. A mind dominated by fear, attachment, and illusion will likely remain bound to those same forces. A consciousness trained in presence, detachment, and clarity tends to cross this transition far more serenely. That is why awakening is not something mystical and distant. It begins now in small daily choices. It begins when you observe your reactions instead of being controlled by them. When you learn to sit in silence with yourself. When you stop seeking outside what can only be built within. It begins when you honestly ask yourself, am I living consciously or merely surviving on autopilot? Am I cultivating peace or feeding inner conflicts daily? Am I building my identity on something eternal or on things that will inevitably change? Every moment of lucidity is a step toward inner freedom, and perhaps in the end, the true purpose of life is not merely to accumulate experiences, possessions, or achievements, but to mature consciousness, to become more present, more awakened, more whole. Because everything external passes, but what you become within, that remains. The problem is that most never develop this consciousness. We live reacting. We react to offenses, frustrations, losses, desires, and fears. We rarely observe our thoughts, rarely question our emotions, rarely reflect on who we are beyond the social roles we play. Thus, we create a fragile identity based on external and transient things. When these structures fall, the mind collapses. Choosing another path means living with presence. It means observing the mind, understanding patterns and developing emotional balance. It means learning to let go, releasing expectations, resentments, attachments, and the need for control. Every detachment in life is training to cross greater changes with serenity. A consciousness that learns to let go in small things does not panic before great transformations. So do our actions and consciousness today shape what we will live afterward? Everything suggests yes, not as punishment or external reward, but as the natural consequence of the inner state cultivated. Just as someone who trains the body reaps health and strength, someone who trains the mind and consciousness reaps stability and lucidity. The universe does not need to judge. Consciousness itself experiences what it has become. A mind dominated by fear creates realities of fear. A mind dominated by anger creates experiences of conflict. A peaceful mind finds peace. This logic already manifests in this life. Anxious people live in constant tension even when everything is fine. Bitter people always find reasons to suffer. Serene people cross difficulties with balance. The same principle, according to spiritual teachings, continues beyond death. For this reason, self-knowledge is one of the greatest forms of spiritual preparation that exist. When someone begins to observe themselves, they realize that they are not the thoughts that arise in the mind. Thoughts appear and disappear. They are not the emotions either, which are also temporary. There is something deeper observing everything, a silent, stable, and conscious presence. The more a person connects with this presence, the less they identify with the mental chaos. This presence is what many traditions call essence, spirit, or pure consciousness. And it is this consciousness that moves through transitions. The more someone lives identified only with the body and the external world, the harder it becomes to let go when the time comes. But the more someone lives aware of their own inner essence, the more natural the change of state becomes. This does not mean abandoning material life or despising the world. On the contrary, it means living with more depth, more love, and more presence. It means enjoying each moment without clinging to it as if it were eternal. Most people suffer because they try to make permanent what is temporary. Relationships change, bodies age, situations transform, everything flows. When we resist this flow, we create pain. When we learn to flow with it, we find peace. To prepare spiritually is to learn to dance with the impermanence of life. It is to accept that everything is born, grows, transforms, and dissolves, including us in the form we know now. But something deeper remains, the consciousness that observes all these changes. Many people believe that spiritual awakening is acquiring powers, visions, or extraordinary mystical experiences. But true awakening is much simpler and much deeper. It is being conscious. It is living awake instead of living on autopilot. It is noticing thoughts before they dominate. It is choosing responses instead of reactions. It is living with intention instead of impulse. This daily training completely shapes the inner experience, and when the great transition arrives, this trained consciousness does not collapse. It recognizes the process as a natural part of the flow of existence. Just as someone who wakes up from a dream realizes that it was not the final reality, many teachings describe death as an awakening to a broader level of consciousness. But for those who never trained lucidity, this awakening can be confusing. For those who lived consciously, it can be liberating. That is why choosing another path is not something that happens in the final second of life. It is built daily. Every time you choose calm instead of anger, you are training your consciousness. Every time you forgive instead of holding resentment, you are freeing your soul. Every time you observe your fears instead of running from them, you are strengthening your inner world. Every time you live with presence, you are awakening. None of this is lost. Everything accumulates as expanded consciousness. In the end, life is not only about what we achieve externally, but about who we become internally. The great illusion is believing that only the physical world matters. The great liberation is realizing that it is only one part of the experience. If our actions, thoughts, and emotional states shape our experience now, why would they not also shape what comes next? The question stops being only about the afterlife and becomes about how we are living today. Are we conscious or distracted? This is one of the most important questions someone can ask throughout life. Most people believe they are living fully, when in reality they are merely reacting to the stimuli around them. The day begins with phone notifications, worries about bills, commitments, social pressures, and external expectations. The mind jumps from past to future, almost never resting in the present. Few realize that in this state, they are not truly living. They are merely functioning. Living consciously means being present in each moment, noticing the thoughts that arise, feeling emotions without being dominated by them, and experiencing reality as it is, not as the mind interprets it. It is a state of inner clarity. Living distracted, on the other hand, is existing on autopilot, repeating habits, reacting impulsively, and being dragged by constant worries. A distracted person can go through years without truly noticing life happening. This unconsciousness has a deep cost. When we are not present, we lose the ability to choose wisely. Decisions become guided by fear, lack, anger, or immediate desire. Relationships become superficial. Important moments go unnoticed. Existence itself becomes a sequence of similar days without true depth. Presence, on the other hand, transforms everything. When someone is truly present, a simple conversation becomes meaningful. A sunset becomes almost sacred. A challenge stops being only suffering and becomes learning. Consciousness expands the perception of life. Are we present or always escaping the now? Escaping the present is one of the most common habits of the human mind. When the current moment is uncomfortable, the mind runs to the past, reliving regrets, guilt, and old wounds. When the present feels boring or uncertain, it runs to the future, creating expectations, fears, and fantasies. Rarely does the mind accept being where the body is. This constant escape generates anxiety and suffering. The past cannot be changed, and the future does not yet exist. Yet both occupy a large part of our mental energy. Meanwhile, the only real moment, the now, is ignored. The present is where life happens. It is where we breathe, feel, love, learn, and truly exist. When we are absent from it, it is as if life passes by without being lived. Many people believe they will be at peace when they solve all problems, reach certain goals, or change certain circumstances. But this future peace almost never arrives, because the mind always finds something new to worry about. True peace does not come from controlling the future, but from fully inhabiting the present. Being present does not mean ignoring responsibilities or failing to plan. It means not living imprisoned by what has already passed or what has not yet happened. It means doing what needs to be done now, with attention and awareness. Are we cultivating peace or feeding inner conflict? This may be the most transformative question of all. Most of the conflict people experience does not come from the external world, but from the mind itself. Repetitive thoughts of comparison, judgment, guilt, fear, and anger create a constant inner battle. Even when everything is relatively fine, many people feel restless inside. Inner peace depends less on circumstances and more on how the mind interprets and reacts to them. Two people can live the same situation. One suffers intensely, the other moves through it with serenity. The difference is not the event, but the inner state. When we feed negative thoughts, we reinforce suffering. When we replay offenses, we reignite pain. When we anticipate disasters, we create unnecessary anxiety. The mind becomes a battlefield. Cultivating peace is learning to observe these thoughts without identifying with them. It is realizing that not every thought is true and not every emotion must be followed. It is developing inner space. This does not mean repressing emotions, but understanding them. Feeling sadness when something hurts is natural. The problem is remaining trapped in it for weeks, months, or years. Feeling anger is human. Living dominated by it destroys inner peace. Consciousness brings choice. Instead of being dragged by the mental storm, a person begins to respond with wisdom. This inner training completely transforms the experience of life. A conscious person suffers less, even when facing difficulties. A present person enjoys small moments more. A peaceful person handles loss and change better. And most importantly, this inner state does not arise by chance, it is cultivated. Each time you take a deep breath before reacting, you are training peace. Each time you observe a negative thought without feeding it, you are creating inner freedom. Each time you choose forgiveness, you are freeing your own mind. Each time you return attention to the now, you are awakening. Modern life makes this difficult. Everything is fast, loud, and stimulating. Silence has become uncomfortable. Being alone with one's own thoughts is something many avoid. Yet it is precisely in silence that consciousness awakens. Without moments of pause, reflection, and presence, the mind remains on autopilot. And an autopilot mind almost always creates suffering. That is why practices such as meditation, conscious breathing, prayer, and introspection have existed for thousands of years. They are not modern trends. They are ancestral tools for training human consciousness. They teach slowing down, observing, and reconnecting with the present moment. Over time, the mind becomes clearer, less reactive, and more serene. And this transformation is not only spiritual, it affects emotional health, relationships, and quality of life. At its core, all these questions point to a single choice: to live consciously or to live distracted. Most choose distraction, often without realizing it. But awakening is always possible. Awakening is not something distant or mystical. It is simply being present now, noticing your breath, feeling your body, observing your thoughts, choosing how to respond. This is the beginning of true inner freedom. When we are conscious, life gains depth. When we are present, we find peace where there was anxiety. When we cultivate inner balance, conflicts lose their power, and little by little, existence stops being a constant struggle and becomes a journey of learning, growth, and awareness. That is why the questions remain as daily invitations. Are we conscious or distracted? None of this is wrong. The problem is not working, loving, taking care of appearance, or valuing health. The problem arises when all of this becomes the foundation of our identity. When we place our sense of worth, security, and meaning exclusively in what is temporary, we create an emotionally fragile life. It is like building a house on sand. While the weather is good, everything seems firm. But when the storm comes, and it always comes, the structure cannot withstand it. Life by its very nature is impermanent. Change is not the exception. It is the rule. Everything is born, grows, transforms, and one day ceases to exist in the form we know. Resisting this is resisting the very flow of existence. A large part of human suffering comes exactly from this resistance. We want work to last forever. We want relationships to never change. We want the body not to age. We want health to be eternal. But life does not work that way. When we are finally forced to face this reality, the shock is profound. The illusions fall. The sense of control disappears. Fear, pain, and often emptiness arise. However, this collapse can also be a portal of transformation. It is in these moments that many people begin to ask, if all of this changes, then where is my true foundation? Who am I beyond these things? These questions are the beginning of inner awakening. Little by little, the understanding arises that everything external is temporary, but there is something internal that remains, the consciousness that observes all these changes. You notice work changing, you notice a relationship ending, you notice the body aging, you notice health fluctuating, but there is always an I observing all of this. This silent observer does not age in the same way. It does not get lost in changes. It does not depend on circumstances to exist. It is the true foundation of experience. When someone begins to identify more with this consciousness than with external situations, something profound happens. Life continues to change, but suffering decreases dramatically. The person learns to live with more lightness, acceptance, and balance. They still feel sadness when something ends, but they are not destroyed inside. They face difficulties, but do not lose the meaning of life. They accept aging, change, and transitions with greater serenity. This is true spiritual maturity. It is not becoming cold or indifferent. It is becoming stable within. It is loving without losing oneself. It is working without defining oneself only by that. It is caring for the body without depending on it for value. It is valuing health without living in constant fear. It is living fully, but without destructive attachment. When we understand the impermanence of life, we begin to enjoy good moments more, without excessive anxiety about losing them, and we face difficult moments with greater inner strength. Suffering decreases not because life becomes perfect, but because we stop fighting what is natural. Change stops being an enemy and becomes part of the journey. Deep down, all the crises that break our fragile identities are pushing us towards something deeper, a life based on consciousness, not just circumstances. When what sustained the external self falls, the true inner self can finally emerge. And it is at this point that many people discover a peace they never found before, a peace that does not depend on a job, a relationship, appearance, or health, a peace that comes from within. That is why so many people collapse when these structures change. It is not just sadness or frustration, it is an identity crisis. It feels as if the ground disappears beneath their feet. A sense of emptiness arises, of loss of meaning, of deep confusion. The mind panics because everything that supported the feeling of security is gone, because everything they relied on disappears. And then comes the shock. It is at this moment that the illusions fall. The illusion of control falls, the belief that we can guarantee everything will remain stable. The illusion of permanence falls, the idea that what we have today will last forever. The illusion that happiness depends only on the external falls. Many people only awaken to these truths when pain appears, when something important is lost, when life changes unexpectedly, when what seemed solid reveals itself to be temporary. This moment can be devastating or transformative. For some, it becomes a period of deep suffering, anger, and despair. For others, it becomes the beginning of an inner awakening. It is when they begin to ask, if all of this can end, then who am I really? Where is my true security? What truly matters? These questions, although born from pain, are doors to consciousness. They lead the individual to realize that everything external is in constant change, and that placing all happiness in it is a permanent source of suffering. Gradually, the understanding arises that there is something deeper, more stable and more real than life's circumstances: consciousness itself. Consciousness is the only element that remains through all changes. Thoughts change, emotions change, situations change, the body changes. But there is always an I observing all of this happening. This silent observer is the foundation of experience. When someone begins to identify more with this consciousness than with external circumstances, something powerful happens. Life continues to change, but suffering decreases dramatically. The person learns to live with more lightness, acceptance, and balance. This does not mean they stop feeling pain when something difficult happens. It means they do not collapse inside. There is sadness, but not despair. There is loss, but not loss of self. This is true spiritual maturity. Understanding that everything that is form is impermanent. Understanding that everything external is temporary. Understanding that the only solid foundation is consciousness. When this understanding deepens, life's changes stop being enemies and become teachers. Every ending becomes an invitation to growth. Every loss turns into learning. Every transformation expands awareness. Many spiritual teachers say that suffering does not come from change, but from resistance to change. We want things to remain as they are when they please us. We fight against the natural flow of life. This struggle creates pain. When we accept impermanence, life flows with much more harmony. This does not mean passivity, but wisdom. We act, care, build, love, but without the unhealthy attachment that generates suffering. Attachment is born from the illusion that what changes can give us permanent security. When this illusion falls, inner freedom is born. And this freedom is deeply liberating. The person begins to enjoy good moments without excessive fear of losing them. They begin to face difficult moments without despair. They learn to live with gratitude for the present and acceptance for what transforms. The collapse of external structures, as painful as it may be, is often the beginning of true awakening. It is when someone stops seeking stability only outside and begins to build balance within. For a long time, most people believe that security comes from circumstances. A good job, a comfortable bank account, a stable relationship, an organized home, social recognition, and well-defined plans. All of this seems to offer protection against life's chaos. While these structures remain firm, the person feels relatively calm, but one unexpected change is enough for this sense of security to crumble. A financial problem, a relationship crisis, a health loss, or professional frustration is enough to generate anxiety, fear, and despair. This happens because stability was supported by external factors, which by nature are unstable. True transformation begins when someone realizes they cannot fully control the world around them, but can learn to care for the inner world. Building balance within means developing a more conscious mind, more regulated emotions, and a healthier relationship with one's own thoughts. It means learning to observe instead of reacting impulsively. It means understanding that suffering does not come only from what happens, but from how we interpret what happens. When this awareness arises, something changes deeply. The person begins to face challenges with greater clarity. They do not panic at every difficulty. They do not despair when something goes out of control. They begin to find an inner center of stability. This center is not indifference. It is inner strength. It is the ability to feel emotions without being dominated by them. It is the ability to deal with losses without losing oneself. It is the maturity to accept changes without collapsing inside. Little by little, external life continues to change, but the interior becomes firmer. It is when happiness stops depending entirely on circumstances. Much of humanity lives in a constant search for ideal conditions to be happy. I will be happy when I achieve this. I will be happy when I solve that problem. I will be happy when my life is organized. But this conditioned happiness almost never arrives in a lasting way. When one goal is reached, another appears. When one problem is solved, a new one arises. The mind is always projecting happiness into the future. Meanwhile, the present is lived with anxiety or dissatisfaction. This pattern creates an endless race. Happiness becomes something external that must be conquered, maintained, and protected. But everything external is unstable. That is why this happiness always comes accompanied by fear of losing it. When someone begins to build happiness from the inside out, this dynamic changes completely. The person realizes that peace does not come from having everything under control, but from accepting impermanence. They learn to appreciate good moments without desperate attachment. They learn to move through difficult moments with hope and balance. This does not mean they stop seeking improvements in life. They continue working, dreaming, building, and developing. The difference is that their joy does not depend entirely on results. They can be grateful now, even while building the future. They find meaning in small things. They feel joy in existing, not only in achieving. This inner state generates a happiness that is more stable, deeper, and less vulnerable to life's fluctuations. It is when peace begins to arise from within. True peace is not the absence of problems. It is the presence of inner balance. Many people believe they will have peace when everything is resolved, when debts end, when the relationship improves, when health stabilizes, when the career takes off. But this external peace is fragile, because it depends on conditions that are always changing. Inner peace is born when the mind calms, when the person learns to accept what cannot be controlled, and when they develop trust in their own ability to move through difficulties. It arises when we stop fighting reality and begin to flow with it. This does not mean passive resignation. It means acting with wisdom, without despair. When peace comes from within, problems continue to exist, but they stop completely dominating the emotional state. The person faces challenges with more serenity, makes clearer decisions, and recovers faster from setbacks. This peace transforms relationships because the person stops projecting frustrations onto others. It transforms work because excessive anxiety decreases. It transforms emotional health because constant stress is reduced. Everything begins within. This process of change does not happen overnight. It requires awareness, practice, and patience. It requires learning to observe one's thoughts. It requires slowing down the mind. It requires developing presence in the now. It requires cultivating gratitude. It requires letting go of what cannot be controlled. Each small step forward strengthens inner balance. At first, the mind is still very restless. Emotions arise strongly. Old reaction habits appear. But little by little, consciousness becomes stronger than impulse, and something wonderful happens. The inner chaos decreases. Over time, the person begins to respond to life with greater wisdom. Where there was once despair, calm arises. Where there was once fear, confidence arises. Where there was once rebellion, acceptance arises. Where there was once anxiety, presence arises. External life does not become perfect, but the inner world becomes more stable. This is true spiritual growth. It is not escaping the world. It is learning to live in it with balance. It is not eliminating problems. It is moving through them with awareness. It is not controlling everything. It is trusting and flowing. When someone builds this inner balance, something profound is revealed. Happiness is not a destination. It is a state of consciousness. It is not in the future. It is in the now. It does not depend only on circumstances, but on how we live each moment. Peace also stops being something to be conquered outside and becomes something to be cultivated within. And when this happens, life takes on another quality. Challenges become lessons. Losses become maturity. Changes become growth. Everything transforms because consciousness transforms. It is at this point that many people finally feel they are truly living, not just surviving. They discover a stability the world cannot take away, a happiness that does not depend on control, a peace that does not break with every storm, and they realize that the true work of life is not organizing everything outside, but awakening and caring for the inner world. That is where true freedom lives. That is why life's falls are not only tragedies, many times they are invitations to consciousness, invitations to release illusions, invitations to spiritually mature, invitations to discover who we are beyond possessions, titles, and situations. When illusions fall, something real can finally arise. Clarity arises, presence arises, inner freedom arises, and then the person realizes that life was never against them. It was only guiding them to a deeper level of consciousness. Deep down, everything that falls was supported by something fragile, and everything that remains is rooted in consciousness. Thus, collapse is not the end. It is the beginning of a more awakened life, a life less based on illusions and more founded in presence. A life where changes do not destroy but transform. And it is exactly at this point that many begin the true inner path, the illusion of control, the illusion of permanence, the illusion that happiness depends only on the external. Without inner awareness, these falls become devastating. The person feels lost, empty, and without meaning. But this pain does not come from change itself. It comes from excessive identification with what changes. Awakened consciousness understands that everything in life is temporary, and therefore it does not cling in a harmful way. It enjoys, loves, builds, but knows how to let go. But it is possible to choose another path. This is the great good news. We are not condemned to live distracted, anxious, and trapped in illusions. Consciousness can be trained, presence can be cultivated, peace can be developed, and it begins with small daily choices, choosing to observe instead of react, choosing to breathe before responding, choosing to be present instead of getting lost in thoughts, choosing to release what cannot be controlled. Little by little, the mind changes, the heart calms, perception expands, a path of awareness, awareness of yourself, awareness of thoughts, awareness of emotions, awareness of the present moment, a path of presence, presence in relationships, presence in simple activities, presence in difficulties, presence in life itself, a path of inner awakening. Awakening to who you truly are beyond social roles, awakening to the temporary nature of things, awakening to the peace that already exists within you. This awakening does not happen all at once. It is a process, a daily practice, a constant return to the present. But every step is worth it, because the more conscious you become, the less you suffer unnecessarily. The more present you live, the more meaning you find in life. The more peace you cultivate, the less the external world destabilizes you. In the end, life is not about controlling everything around you, but about learning to live well inside. These questions are not just beautiful reflections. They are daily invitations to awakening. Are we conscious or distracted? Are we present or always running from the now? Are we cultivating peace or feeding inner conflict? Answering them with how we live transforms the entire journey. And this is the other path, the path of consciousness, of presence, of inner awakening. And this path begins now, in this very moment, with the simple decision to live more consciously. Nothing remains exactly the same forever. Jobs end, companies close, markets change. Relationships go through crises, transform, or come to an end. The body inevitably ages. Health, no matter how well cared for, can fail at some point. These transformations are not exceptions, they are a natural part of existence. Still, much of humanity lives as if everything were permanent, as if tomorrow were guaranteed, as if the structures that sustain identity would never disappear. Since ancient times, wise teachers and spiritual traditions have taught that human beings are not just flesh and bone, but consciousness in experience. The body is like a temporary garment, and the mind the instrument through which the soul expresses itself in this world. When this garment is left behind, what remains are not titles, possessions, or appearance, but the level of consciousness cultivated throughout life. What we became inside is what accompanies us. From this arises the inevitable question: if all this is real, are you prepared for what happens after death? Most people live without reflecting on this reality. The mind is always busy, always running, always distracted. Life is spent worrying about bills, status, approval, success, and momentary pleasure, but rarely looking within, rarely questioning who we truly are beyond the roles we play. And when the structures of material life begin to fall, whether through loss, illness, financial crisis, or the simple passage of time, many collapse. Not because the pain is unbearable, but because everything they leaned on disappears at once. Much of humanity builds its identity on temporary things. When someone builds their entire identity on work, losing a job is not just losing a function, it is losing who they believe they are. Emptiness arises, fear arises, the feeling of having no value arises. When someone defines themselves by a relationship, a breakup is not just a separation, it is a deep emotional collapse. The person feels they have lost their own existence. When someone relies completely on appearance, aging becomes a cruel enemy. Every wrinkle becomes a threat. Every bodily change creates suffering. When health is seen as an eternal guarantee, any diagnosis turns into absolute despair. Thus, fragile identities are built on things that inevitably change. And when they change, because they always do, illusions fall. It is at this moment that many awaken. They realize that seeking stability only outside is like building a house on sand. It may seem firm for a while, but any storm is enough to bring everything down. Then another path emerges. A path of awareness, of presence, of inner awakening. It is when a person stops seeking security only in external circumstances and begins building balance within. It is when happiness stops depending entirely on what happens outside. It is when peace begins to arise from within. That is why, since ancient times, wise teachers have always taught practices such as meditation, introspection, mastery of the mind, and study of spiritual teachings, not as empty rituals, but as tools to prepare consciousness. Just as an unprepared person panics during an earthquake, a mind without training collapses during major life changes, and also in the transition of death. A trained consciousness learns to observe emotions without drowning in them. It learns to perceive thoughts without being enslaved by them. It learns to remain stable even when everything changes around it. This does not mean the absence of pain. It means maturity to move through it. And if this applies to losses and crises in life, why would it not apply to the moment we leave the body? If death is only a change of state of consciousness, then what we carry with us is not material possessions, status, or appearance, but the level of clarity, peace, or confusion we cultivated. A mind dominated by fear, attachment, and illusions tends to remain trapped in those same forces. A consciousness developed in presence, detachment, and love tends to cross that passage with serenity. Therefore, true awakening begins now. It begins when you observe your reactions instead of being controlled by them. When you learn to silence the inner noise. When you stop seeking outside what can only be built within. Are we conscious or distracted? Are we present or always fleeing from the now? Are we cultivating peace or feeding inner conflict? The way we answer these questions, not with words, but with how we live, completely defines our life experience. Because in the end, it is not death that defines our experience. It is the level of consciousness with which we live. Reflect on this. If this message awakens something in you, continue seeking, expanding your vision, and questioning what has always been accepted without reflection. Perhaps this is the first step to breaking the cycle and awakening to something far greater than this limited existence. And now listen to this message from God to you. Son, daughter, I did not create you to live imprisoned by fear, loss, and the illusions of this passing world. I formed you for eternity, for consciousness, for life that does not fade. Everything that falls before you is only what was never truly yours. I remain when all passes. I am your peace when the world trembles. I am your strength when everything seems to collapse. Do not fear change, for it is a gateway to growth. Do not fear death, for I am life. Turn your heart inward, where I dwell. Be still, trust, awaken. Each step of awareness brings you closer to the freedom I have prepared for you. I walk with you now in pain and in joy, in loss and in rebuilding, and when you cross life's thresholds, I will be there, with light, love, and welcome. Awaken, beloved child. Live consciously. Live in peace. Live in me. May this truth touch your heart, transform the way you live, and guide your steps toward a fuller, awakened life filled with light.